Although PIDtoolbox has been tailored around Betaflight, we can use it to tune drones running other firmwares like iNav or FetTech. Today I'm going to show you how to tune a drone running KISS Ultra using PIDtoolbox. Now, although KISS Ultra doesn't have a PID slider system like Betaflight, we can take advantage of PTB's slider system, which allows us to tune using the same basic framework as we used in the past with Betaflight. So I have here a 5-inch running KISS Ultra, and traditionally people would tune this based on feel. And while there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, not everybody's going to be great at it. And in the end, you're still not really going to know whether you're undertuned, overtuned, or whether you have some other underlying issue that you're not even aware of. Instead, we can do this in a very objective way, and I'm going to show you how to do that with PIDtoolbox. I think you'll find the results pretty interesting. So the first thing we're going to have to do though is we're going to have to set up a logging device because the KISS flight controller doesn't come with data logging. So you can see here that I've got an external logger. This is the Open Logger from Airbot. I'll put a link in the description where you can purchase one of those. They work really well. And you'll notice that I have mine connected via a little wire that plugs into the side of the flight controller. I believe that's UART3 I'm using for that. Now, the reason I do it that way is because once I'm done the tuning, I can simply unplug this and pull the entire logger off. You might instead want the logger direct soldered, but that's up to yourself. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and plug this into the configurator. So the KISS Ultra configurator, go to kissultra.com and you're gonna plug in your flight controller, hit the connect, and then we're looking for this and connect. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail about setting up a KISS rig. There are plenty of videos out there that already have information about setting up a KISS Ultra rig. So we're open in the KISS configurator. We're going to go right to the Advanced tab, and you're going to scroll down here until you see the serial configuration. And I have my logger set up on serial on UART3. That's what the plug was there on the side, so it's just convenient for me. Then we're going to come down here to black box configuration. I've got the log level set to 100, and then the baud rate in this case is set to 2 million. We're just going to set in the debug the raw gyroscope. That's it. And you're going to just hit save on that. Let me talk briefly about the filters. KISS Ultra has a few different filter options. They have, starting at the top here, an adaptive filter. Below that you have 2 notch filters. And then below that you have what are called advanced LPF low pass filter settings. So they don't really give you a lot of detail with the low pass filter like Betaflight. So you just have a drop down to set the roll pitch low pass filter to either off, high, medium, medium, low, and so on. The lower you put this, you're basically adding more filtering. So it's a lower cutoff. It's like taking the Betaflight slider and sliding it towards the left. And there's also a yaw low pass filter that works very much the same as it does on the roll and pitch, but it's broken out independently for the yaw axis. And then finally there's a D-term low pass filter. The main thing to take home from these low pass filters is the roll pitch low pass filter is a very gentle filter. It's something akin to probably a PT1 in Betaflight, so it really is not doing very much. But when you go down to the D-term low pass filter, this is much more intense. So you want to be really careful with setting the D-term low pass filter too low. Just know that you can really generate a lot of filter delay from the D-term low pass filter if it's set too low, and that can cause a flyaway right out of the gate, so be real careful with that. And then the one I mentioned earlier was the adaptive filter, and that is essentially acting like a dynamic notch. I'll give you good evidence as to why I'm pretty sure that's what it is, but it really costs little to have it, so you're just going to want to have that enabled. So we are going to be doing this tuning using the sliders in PIDtoolbox. Now the slider system is not identical to Betaflight, but it still follows the same conventions, which is tuning, for example, the P to D balance and the P to I balance and that sort of thing. And it has a master multiplier and a separate slider to change the ratio between roll and pitch. So we're going to do all that in there. But in the meantime, we need to know where is safe to start the PIDs. So we'll come back here to the configuration tab in the KISS configurator, and you'll notice that I am starting the roll and the pitch with these PIDs. So they're relatively low. For some larger rigs, they might be a little bit too low, but it's better to start on that safe side than a little too high, because you could already I'm not even sure if the defaults are a lot higher than this. I believe they are. And if the defaults are too high, if you have a really powerful light rig, you could already be overtuned right from the get-go. So it's always good to start these a little bit lower. So what are we going to do? So we're going to go right over to PIDtoolbox. We're going to go to the PID slider tool. So simply click on that. And you'll see this tool has a drop down to select the different firmware. So we're just going to select KISS Ultra here. And if you notice here, this is the PID start values. So by default, I've started these values here at 1.5 on the P, 0.05 on the I, and 5 on the D. What we're going to do now is we're going to adjust the sliders here until we match what I said we would start at, our current PID settings for this drone. So we want 1.5, 0.1, and 3. So we go back to our slider. We're already at 1.5 on the P. We're going to go and bring the I term down. That's this slider. The P to I ratio is the I term slider. So we'll drop that back until we have 0.1 here. You see that? So these are the test values. These are our start values. And then we're going to drop the D. That's the P to D ratio here. We're going to drop that back until we see 3 here. Okay, so we'll just bring that back. Okay. All right, so that's where we're going to start our tests. For all these tuning tests as well, you're going to want to keep the set point weight set to 0, okay? So what set point weight does is essentially it changes the way the D term is calculated. And when the set point weight is set to 0, D term is derived directly from the gyro itself. And you want to do that for all of the PID tuning. Once we're done the tuning, then we can start to raise the set point weight to take advantage of the extra sort of snappiness that you get from higher set point weight values. But during all of the tuning, you're going to want the set point weight set at 0. So traditionally, with the way we would do this is we would do what we call wobble tests. So essentially, line of sight, we're going to arm the drone, bring it up to, say, eye level, out in front of yourself, facing away. And we're going to basically wobble the drone back and forth in the roll axis and then in the pitch axis, right? I'm going to demonstrate that for you in a moment. One more thing I have to mention here, though, is that traditionally I recommend doing this in beta flight in angle mode or level mode. But in KISS, you can't do that because angle mode works differently and you'll get really weird results. So instead, if you come over here, what we're going to do is we're going to do it in acro mode. But to make these tests safe, what we're going to do is change your rates. We're going to go to the rates tab, and you'll notice here that I have the RC rate set to 1, rate is set to 0, and the RC curve is 0. And that gives us a linear rate with a maximum of 200 degrees per second. This way, when we start wobbling it around, it's not going to get out of control if we accidentally hit the stick really hard, right? So, and a linear rate is going to be much more controllable, and it tends to give you really nice results. So I'm going to illustrate that now with a first test with our PIDs set up as they are. So let's do that. Here we go. Just going to arm, bring it up, and we're just going to move the axis down. Now, I tend to do this fairly randomly in both axes. It is a bit tricky, and it's certainly something to get used to. Let's take a look at it. So what we're doing right now is we're adjusting the D term, essentially, the P to D balance. So there's plenty of videos out there describing that in using beta flight. So conceptually, what we're doing is there is a kind of optimal relationship between P and D. And so what we do is we start with the D term below which it lower than it should be, and we're going to slowly raise it up until we optimize that. So we'll call that PD 0.6, and then we'll just say we'll just leave it at that, PD 0.6. Okay. We're going to click Open File, navigate to our folder, and open. Okay, so we got 2 log files in there. We'll open both of them. We did 2 tests there, but they should be pretty much the same anyway. So you can see here the roll and the pitch axis, there's lots going on there. So this is the kind of movement you want, and you'll notice it's about 30 seconds long, but there's continuous movement. It's really important. So sometimes one of the flaws that people make here is often they struggle with it if you're not used to line of sight flying, so the drone might start to drift away on you, and so then you got to bring it back, and so there'll be spaces in the log file where there's not enough movement. So if you do find yourself having to do that, you're going to want to do this a little bit longer than the 20 or 30 seconds I have here. But in my case, this is going to give us a lot of data to work with. Okay. So normally we could trim these. If we want to, we can trim them. So what we do is press the I key to trim the beginning. Just move the slider to where we want it to start. Leaving a bit of space here is fine because the algorithm in PIDtoolbox ignores where there's not much movement. So the movement has to be of a certain magnitude before it would even take the data anyway. And so we're going to hit the O button to set the out position, the out window, and that just allows us to take all the data that we want to analyze. Okay, so we're going to head on over to the step response tool. So we have 2 files there. Of course, we did both of them. They're the same settings, so that's fine, but we can look at both. So you can see both look pretty much identical, which is good. So let's just plot one of them just for clarity. We'll just hit reset and run again. So you'll notice here that the step response it looks pretty nice, but you can see this obvious overshoot here, right, on roll and pitch. So we're going to take 2 things here. So this is good information that we need to increase the D term, right? As we increase the D term, you're going to notice this coming down. All right, that's the first thing to take from this. The other thing you'll notice is, unfortunately, KISS Ultra doesn't provide the PID information in the log file. So we don't know what the settings are, and so we can't plot it up here. So you have to just keep track of that yourself, knowing what those settings are, right? And the other thing we're going to look at here is the roll to pitch latency. So if you see that the latency is a lot higher on one axis than the other, then another thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to boost the PIDs overall on that axis. So you can see that clearly the pitch axis is showing a latency of roughly 24 milliseconds, whereas the roll is around 20 milliseconds. So right away, there's 2 things we're going to want to do for our next tests. We're going to slowly increase the D term, but before we even do that, we're going to give pitch a boost. We're going to boost up the PIDs together. So how are we going to do that? So without a slider system, it's kind of complicated to do that, right? Because you have to proportionally increase the values of the P, I, and D together, or else you're not going to maintain the ratios, right? So we come back to our slider system. So 2 things we want to do. We're going to first increase our P to D ratio here. So we're going to boost it by a step of 0.2. So we don't want to do too small of increments, because you won't notice any difference if you do, right? So we're going to bump that up to 0.8, and then we're going to also do a test at 1.0, 1.2, and so on. So we'll start 0.8 there, and then we're going to bump up the roll to pitch ratio. So when we bump this up, you'll notice that the pitch axis gets boosted. So we're just going to bump that up to 1.2 for now, do our next test, and take a look at it. Okay, we're going to save that, and we are ready for another test. So again, we're in acro mode, just arm. Bring it up to eye level, and then start the wobble. If you find the rates at 200 degrees per second a bit too high, you can always drop it back a bit. And you don't really have to give it really super aggressive inputs either. It's more important to get like a lot of data than necessarily really aggressive data. As you get tuning this, one of the things that you're going to find is that it's going to get easier and easier, because as you start to increase the D and increase the PIDs and get closer to the optimal tune, this will actually get easier as well. So you'll know that you're heading towards a decent tune. So You know, in part, that's the feel part that we're talking about, right? But it's nice to be able to then associate that thing that we call feel with some numbers on the screen. And it starts to make a lot of sense when you do that. Okay, let's check. Let's come back to PIDtoolbox and let's open up those files. So you can see you can see that overshoot is systematically coming down, right? On roll and on pitch. The other thing you'll notice is that when we boosted pitch, notice that the latency came down, of course, because we boosted that overall axis, right? So let's take a look at that second one and compare those. So you can see the orange was the second test where we first boosted pitch, and you can see that the roll axis we're at about 21 milliseconds and pitch we're at about 21, 22. And then we want to look at that ratio going all the way through. So you can see this one is at about 20, the yellow is at about 21, and we're at about 22 on pitch. So we could use a little more of a boost on pitch. That's because we've got this extra weight, right, with the GoPro up front and the battery. So all the weight is distributed across the pitch axis. That's pretty typical of a freestyle frame. So we could probably boost the pitch axis even a little bit more. And you can see that we still need a little more D term as well, right? So you still have some overshoot there. So let's take a look at that last one by itself because it's a little bit clearer then. Okay, so you'll see sometimes this drift. Don't let that bother you. The main thing you want to focus on when examining the P to D balance is this initial overshoot. So ideally you don't want that to happen too much, so you will get some drift, especially because we've set the Iterm particularly low during these tests so we don't get confused between Iterm related overshoot and P to D balance related overshoot. Okay, so all right, so we're going to boost the pitch a little bit and add a little more D again. So let's go back. And so we're going to boost the PD balance up to 1.4, and then we're going to boost pitch just a little bit more, maybe to 1.3 will do it there, okay? So these are the numbers we're working with. Hit save on that, and let's rock and roll. Okay, so another thing you're going to notice as you get doing these tests is when you look at the raw data, you're going to notice that part of the reason why it feels so much more connected is you can also see that the relationship between the set point and gyro starts to look better and better. So when you zoom in on this, you can start to see how well the set point and gyro follow one another, right? Or how well the gyro is following the set point. Okay. So let's go back out now again, go into step response tool, and let's just plot that one alone. Okay, so you see we're getting closer and closer here, especially on pitch. Again, don't worry too much about that drift. The main thing is the shape of this curve here, right? This would be overshoot here. Okay, so we could still use a little bit more D, and we're pretty much on point then. So I would just bump that up one more time and we're pretty much there. So we'll come back to our slider. We're going to want 1.6 on the D. See that? Okay. Then let's go back to our firmware. Open up the configurator on pitch. Hit save. All right, this should be pretty darn close. So we're going to go into step response. Let's take a look at that last one. You can see that's still pretty good. So there's still a tiny bit of overshoot there. Part of that could actually be Iterm. So I think what's going to happen is that's going to get locked in once we start boosting the master. The other thing we forgot to look at is that extra little boost in the pitch axis, and you can see that it's working pretty good. We're at about 22 milliseconds on pitch and about 21 or so on roll. So that's pretty good. You don't necessarily have to have them perfectly matched, but the thing is, this is a great example of how you wouldn't know that if you were just tuning by feel. You know, you would turn up the PIDs and you would think you need so much, but how much? And, you know, it's a bit of more of a guessing game. So we can see there that looks pretty good. So we're going to start now. We're going to move into the master multiplier tests. So we'll go back to our configurator and go back to our sliders. So our master was defaulted here at a 1.0. So what this is going to do now is it's going to push all of our PIDs up at the same time. So we're going to boost the master. Let's bump that up to 1.2 here, and that gives us 1.8, 0.12. So we've got to change a lot more numbers here to get that set up. So, all right, so we managed to go through a series of tests with Master Multiplier all the way from 1.0 up to 2.0 in steps of 0.2. So that's 1.0, 1.2, 1.6, 1.8, and 2.0. Nothing bad happened in either one of them, so we're going to go take a look at those results. Sometimes it's the case that you won't have a problem. Like, this is a really clean rig, and there's not really a lot of motor noise or anything like that, so sometimes that's the case. But then the question is, but then the point becomes, you have to have a different metric then to decide on whether you want to push the master gain that high, because it could be the case that you simply keep pushing the gains, you don't get a problem, but you don't really gain anything from it, right? What we're looking at is the latency delta. The delta, that's the difference in latency between tests. So as we increase the master multiplier, is the latency value going down and down, or is it basically plateauing at some point? So we're going to take a look at those results. Let's look at 1.2 up to 2.0 and take a look at these. So a lot of this is kind of surprising for me too, right? Because like, you never know what's going to happen. So you can see the green is starting to look really good there. So notice that the curve is starting to plateau here. You can see the curve comes down, but it's starting to turn right here at the last test, right? It might be a case where we could push the master a little bit further, but I'm actually going to stop now just for the sake of finishing this video. But so let me just plot that last one. It actually looks pretty good. So you can see that's pretty locked in, right? Both of them look really good. You can look at the 1.8. Yeah, it's absolutely fine. There might be a hint of an oscillation starting. So sometimes when you get this sort of like dip like that, the first thing most people think is that this is over dampened, but really what it is it can be representative of the beginning of an oscillation. What'll happen if you keep boosting, if this is oscillation, then as we boost the master further, what you'll start to notice is this will start to go down right here and start to ripple. And the higher you go, you'll start to get 2 or 3 ripples until you get a full-blown oscillation. I'm not going to go there with this. I think I'm actually going to stop it at 2.0 and give it a good test flight. We will finish the rest of the PIDs now, but overall this looks pretty good. I didn't mention anything about this high frequency, little bit of a high frequency noise going through it. In part, one of the things that I noticed about both KISS Ultra and FETtech is they don't do a lot of filtering on the gyro side, unlike Betaflight. Betaflight does a lot of filtering on the gyro. And it might be maybe it's part of the secret sauce of KISS or FETtech, I don't know. But I do know from experience that if you want to reduce filter delay is obviously your enemy. You don't want too much filter delay, but especially on the gyro. You can get away with more filter delay on the D term for sure. And I think the way KISS Ultra and FETtech do that is they do more filtering on the D term side if it's needed, right? And so that means the gyro might be a little noisier than a typical Betaflight craft. And because the step response relies on the gyro, that's why you'll see a little bit more noise in the step response when looking at FETtech or KISS Ultra. And so sometimes what I do is set the smoothing here, a smoothing parameter on the step response just for the sake of the tests, if that noise is particularly high. And you can see that once we do that, this smoothens right out, right? So all that drop down does is it's essentially just smoothing the gyro just for the sake of reading the log files. It makes it sometimes a little bit easier to interpret them. So that's all that is. So we run these tests again now with that smooth. You can see it's a little bit easier to see. Okay, so let's come back to our drone and let's finalize some of this up. So the last thing we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to tune Yaw, and we're going to want to set the Iterm. Now, we can do the same kind of test by boosting Iterm, and what the metric we'd be looking for there is we'd be looking for whether it starts to overshoot again. So as you increase Iterm, at some point you're going to start to see overshoot again, very likely. But that overshoot's going to tend to be a little bit more elongated. It's going to be a little more prolonged in terms of time. And in terms of yaw, the way I treat yaw, generally we don't need much, if any, D-term on yaw. Betaflight traditionally doesn't use any D-term at all. So we're going to just keep the yaw D-term at the 0.2 here. But we can boost the yaw P to at least as high or higher than any of the other axes. So there's no reason we can't boost this up to 4 or 5, right? So we're going to just plunk that in for now. Now you can do this as well on the yaw axis, but it's a lot trickier to tune yaw, and I haven't really developed, nor does anybody really have, a really good objective way of tuning yaw. It's really tricky because when you start wobbling the yaw axis, one of the problems that you'll find is you start getting these bumps up in altitude. So in part it's a bit risky, a little more dangerous to do, and also there's no real P to D balance necessary in the yaw axis. You don't typically get the same kind of overshoot related to a lack of D-term on the yaw axis unless the rig was exceptionally powerful. It just doesn't happen. So for yaw, we're just going to boost the P and the I terms, and we'll push them some value a little bit higher than the highest of the other two axes. So if I'm at about 3 or 4 P term on the roll or pitch axis, I'll just boost yaw about 10 to 20% higher than that. So setting it at 5 in this case is fine.